tonight's speaker is someone I have known for a very long time. And I am tonight's speaker, actually. And I was trying to count them up. This is my 8th presentation to the Torch Club of Lincoln. Yes.
And every one of them great presentations.
Thank you, Carroll. Your tip is in the mail. Yes, Bob?
At least one of them or more have been Paxton.
Only one has been a Paxton winner. Yes, thank you.
You know,
Thank you.
your natural modesty tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, okay. There is an annual prize in the International Association of Torch Clubs for the best paper submitted to the magazine, and for 2023, I was the winner. So I was there in Baltimore along with Jim Johnson, representing Lincoln Torch, Tom Carroll Torch, and it went over well, wouldn't you say, honey? Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. And my paper tonight is on a subject that's of long time interest to me, and I have a PowerPoint thanks to, which you can see, thanks to Mark Domke, who very foresightedly brought a lot of his own equipment tonight, because the house equipment was inexplicably, failing. And so, but here we go. That's my title, What is to be Thought of Her? And the subtitle is 4 Perspectives on Our Continuing Fascination with Joan of Arc. And my interest in Joan of Arc began with a Classics Illustrated comic book that my parents gave me when I was about 6, and I still have it. It's right here. And the comic book was first published in 1955. On its cover, Joan has a Doris Day haircut and seems to be wearing lipstick and eye makeup. But the illustrated narrative inside, I am happy to report, does a reasonably good job of sticking to the story of the actual historical Joan. That story captivated the 6-year-old me, and still captivates the 69-year-old me, as it has captivated English and American writers like Thomas De Quincey, Mark Twain, George Bernard Shaw, Vida Sackville-West, and most recently Catherine Chen, whose novel Joan was published in June of this year. And my title is the first sentence of De Quincey's essay, as it happens. What is to be thought of her? There are literally thousands of books about her in French by such writers as Voltaire, the great historian Jules Michelet, the mystic poet Charles Péguy, and the novelist Anatole France. Friedrich Schiller and Bertolt Brecht wrote plays about her in German. Giuseppe Verdi wrote an opera about her in Italian. She is the subject of numerous films, one of which, Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928, frequently appears on lists of the greatest films of all time. The most recent film about her was released just in 2019. Leonard Cohen, Madonna, and Arcade Fire have written songs about her. What makes Joan so compelling a figure to remember, to study, and to imagine? I propose that this enduring fascination has to do with 4 questions capable of prompting deep thought and strong feeling in her time and in ours. 4 questions that we will not be able to answer tonight or probably ever, but are worth pondering. First, what should we make of people who claim God is talking to them? 2, does God take particular interest in particular nations? 3, can male-dominated institutions learn to share authority and power with women? And 4, what does it mean that a few people feel their psychological integrity requires them to wear the clothing of the gender opposite the one they were assigned at birth? Before tackling those questions, let me summarize Joan's career, doing my best to be brief. She was born in 1412 to a modest family in the village of Domremy in the province of Lorraine at a particularly turbulent moment in French history. Okay, I don't know how visible that is. But the King of England, Henry V, oh, there we go. Henry V, over there on the right, left, sorry, was pressing his claim to the throne of France, a claim that the kings of England had been making since the onset of the Hundred Years' War in 1337. Henry V came as close as any English king ever did to making the claim stick, thanks to first his own military skill, second an alliance with the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who you kind of see in the middle, the Dukes of Burgundy, and third the precarious mental health of the French king, Charles VI, on the other side, who sometimes suffered the delusion that he was made of glass. The Duke of Burgundy was a cousin to Charles VI, but that family's relations had badly deteriorated during a series of betrayals and assassinations as messy as anything in Game of Thrones or The Sopranos. By 1420, when Joan was 8, Henry had engineered the Treaty of Troyes, which contracted him in marriage to Charles' daughter, Catherine, down there, and kind of in the middle, and declared Charles' son, also named Charles, illegitimate. And this was with the consent of Charles's wife and queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who had been having an affair with Charles's brother, the Duke of Orleans, who had been assassinated by the Duke of Burgundy. So this is messy, as I say. So hence the question mark over here. Was Charles the son of Louis and Isabeau, or Charles and Isabeau? And of course his claim to the throne depends on his being Charles's son. So, things were going Henry's way, but in 1422 he unexpectedly died, just short of his 36th birthday, leaving the throne to his and Catherine's son, Henry VI, who was not yet 2. So, as of 1425, the infant King Henry's uncle, the Duke of Bedford, is governing on his behalf and controls most of the there we go. That's it. The pink, most of the northern half of France, the French territory, including its capital, Paris. England's ally, the Duke of Burgundy, controls the rest of the northern part of France, and the Duke's soldiers sometimes go marauding into parts of the country still loyal to the old royal line, such as Domremy, where Joan and her family live. Her family's house is not burned down, but those of some of her neighbors are. Charles VII, as we can call him, even though he has not yet had a traditional coronation, has established a court in the city of Chinon, and still has the loyalty of the southern half of France, but he is on the ropes. One of the last important cities loyal to him, Orléans on the Loire River, which is about in the middle, just south of Paris, on the right where the pink and the blue meet, is under siege, and he seems to have neither the means nor the will to come to their aid. This is the context in which Joan, at age 13, begins to hear her voices. Years later, at her trial for heresy, she identified them as the Archangel Michael, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret of Antioch. According to her own report, the voices tell her to lead an army to lift the siege at Orléans and see to it that the Dauphin, that is the crown prince, Charles VII, is crowned with full ceremony in the city of Rheims, where French kings were traditionally crowned, which is, Rheims is up here. Early in 1429, when she is 17, she persuades a local nobleman, Robert de Baudricourt, to bring her before the Dauphin. She has cut her hair and adopted male dress, but retains a female identity as La Pucelle, the maid. While alone with the Dauphin, she tells him a secret about himself that it seems impossible for her to have known. He arranges for a committee of churchmen to examine her, and after 2 weeks, they give her their carefully qualified approval. With crucial support from his mother-in-law, Queen Yolande of Aragon, Charles manages to raise an army for Joan and provide her with a suit of armor. In the spring, she leads the army to the city of Orléans, even takes part in some of the fighting, and raises the siege. Several other cities in the region change their allegiance to Charles, and the French win a surprising and overwhelming victory at the Battle of Patay. In July, she brings Charles to the city of Rheims, even though it is deep within English-held territory, and he is crowned king with the full ancient ceremony. Mission accomplished. A prominent French writer of that time, Christine de Pizan, that year devoted a poem to Joan's accomplishments. One verse of which reads, in modern English prose translation, "You, Joan, were born at a propitious hour. Blessed be he who created you, made, ordained by God, in whom the Holy Spirit poured his great grace and never refused any of your requests. How can we ever reward you?" The rest of Joan's story, however, is much grimmer. She leads several more military expeditions, including an attempt to take Paris, but with little success. In May of 1430, during a fight with Burgundian forces, she is taken prisoner. Charles makes no attempt to ransom her, and she is handed over, in effect sold, to the English. The English turn her over to the church to be tried for heresy and/or witchcraft. About 30 officials and University of Paris theologians, who are French but pro-Henry, examine her over a course of several months. She stands firm, alone and unsupported though she is, for a very long time, but finally abjures. She signs a confession that she lied about the voices and resumes wearing women's clothes. Just a couple of days later, though, she withdraws her abjuration and again dresses in men's clothes. As a heretic who has abjured her heresy but then returned to it, she is now subject to the death penalty. The church turns her over to the civil authorities, the English, and she is burned at the stake in the city of Rouen, which is kind of up towards the northwest there. On May 30th, 1431, 2 years and 3 weeks after the raising of the siege of Orleans. So now let's return to the questions. First, what should we make of people who claim God is talking to them? In our own day, most of us would suggest consultation with a mental health professional who might prescribe medications or might even recommend institutionalization if God's messengers seem likely to cause harm to themselves or others. The great historian Johann Huizinga joked that while Joan's judges needed several months to reach their conclusions, modern psychologists, quote, would have been ready with their statement within half an hour at the outside. Let's keep in mind, though, that most Europeans of the later Middle Ages would not have automatically believed Joan either. Such claims were frequently made but usually dismissed. One French historian found 20 recorded cases in 1428 alone of people, mainly women, appearing at Charles's court claiming to have a message from God. There must have been something different about Joan. Charles's committee of approximately 17 churchmen concluded she might be the real thing and should be given her chance to prove herself at Orleans. Her subsequent early success persuaded many that she was the real thing. Christine de Pizan compared her to Moses and Joshua, reasoning that a simple shepherdess, as she calls her, could not have accomplished what she did without God's assistance. Joan's success was a miracle, they thought. Strong evidence that she was telling the truth and was divinely guided. Now, few of us now, I suspect, would reach the same conclusion. Still, just as we might stop short of concluding she was divinely guided, we might also stop short of concluding that she was mentally ill. Her success where so many had failed, her ability to inspire, her presence of mind during her trial, all suggest she was at least what we now call high functioning. The 19th century French historian Jules Michelet, who was not friendly towards the church, wrote of her, Joan's eminent originality was her common sense. This set her apart from the multitude of enthusiasts who in ages of ignorance have swayed the masses. In most cases, they derived their power from some dark, contagious force of unreason. Her influence, on the contrary, was due to the clear light she was able to throw upon an obscure situation, through the unique virtue of her good sense and of her loving heart. Joan did not seem to her contemporaries to be out of her wits, and her recorded actions do not seem like those of a person out of her wits. Her internal voices may not be those of a schizophrenic. I'm going to propose another way to think about them. Although we are less credulous and more skeptical than the people of the 15th century, would we all affirm that important communications from an immaterial power outside ourselves simply and absolutely never occur? I don't think we would all agree with that. I do not think we all would. Let me first invoke William James, who in the Varieties of Religious Experience said of mystical states that they, quote, usually are and have the right to be absolutely authoritative over the person to whom they occur. They have the right to be authoritative for the mystic for the same reason that when you say you have a headache, I have no good grounds to tell you that you don't. James goes so far as to conclude that, quote, the existence of mystical states absolutely overthrows the pretension of non-mystical states to be the sole and ultimate dictators of what we may believe. Unless we are hardcore material realists, we may be willing to suspend our skepticism in a few cases. My brother Burns, a Presbyterian minister, likes to talk about nudges. A nudge is felt internally, but its source seems to be external to the self. For instance, the great Russian chemist Dmitri Mendeleev said that the arrangement of elements in what we now call the periodic table came to him in a dream. I saw in a dream a table where all elements fell into place as required. Awakening, I immediately wrote it down on a piece of paper. Only in one place did a correction later seem necessary. Socrates' daemon, who sometimes spoke very clearly to him about what he ought not to do, is a famous example. My brother's favorite example is Martin Luther King. During the early stages of the Montgomery bus boycott, as the threats and attacks began to mount, King sat at his family's kitchen table and said out loud, "I've come to the point where I can't face it alone." Then, according to King's biographer, Taylor Branch, quote, "As he spoke these words, the fears suddenly began to melt away. He became intensely aware of what he called an inner voice telling him to do what he thought was right. Such simplicity worked miracles, bringing a shudder of relief and the courage to face anything. It was for King the first transcendent religious experience of his life," unquote. King's feeling relief may even be a little like Joan saying at the trial that the voices always brought her great comfort, was her phrase. So one way to think about Joan's voices is that she heard clearly and distinctly what most of us hear only dimly and distantly, and what a few like Mendeleev and King and Socrates hear clearly perhaps only a few times. Perhaps the universe is speaking to all of us all of the time, but its voice is all but inaudible within the white noise of our lived experience. At her trial, Joan expressed the wish that everyone could hear the voice as clearly as she did. Johann Huizinga poses a telling rhetorical question on just this point. I don't think do I have this in the next slide? I don't think maybe if, nope, go back. Anyway, he said, "Indeed, if every inspiration that comes to one with such commanding urgency that it is heard as a voice is to be condemned out of hand as a morbid symptom, a hallucination, who would not rather stand with Joan of Arc and Socrates on the side of the mad than with the faculty of the Sorbonne on that of the sane?" You may be wondering, though, what if the voice you hear clearly and distinctly is telling you to kill someone? Such messages seem to belong squarely in the province of mental illness. And we could say Joan's messages amount to that, since she was being told to lead a war against the English. This brings us to our second question. Does God take particular interest in particular nations? Most of us, I expect, find the notion repellent, insofar as it inspires movements like Christian nationalism in our own country and suicide bombers all over the world. We might even call it toxic. Consider this passage from a letter that Joan dictated and had sent to King Henry VI of England and his regent, the Duke of Bedford. She, that is Joan herself, La Pucelle, referring to herself in the third person. "She has come in God's name to proclaim the blood royal, wholly ready for peace if you wish to do right by her, to abandon France and to pay for what you have taken. King of England, if you refuse this, I am a captain of war, and wherever I find your men in France, I will force them to leave, whether they wish to or not. If they refuse to obey, I will have them all killed. I am sent by God, the King of Heaven, to chase you one and all from France." Joan's fierce declaration of the principle that France belongs to the French, combined with her devout Catholicism and commitment to the crown, has made her an icon of the French right from the middle of the 19th century right up to the present day, including, ironically, the collaborationist Vichy government. National Rally, the far-right party, led by Marine Le Pen, holds a ceremony every May 1st to lay a wreath at the base of a large gilded equestrian statue of Joan in central Paris, and that's what that is in the picture. Joan's ultimatum to the English does superficially resemble the anti-immigrant policies of parties like National Rally and their pursuit of what Joan's scholar Nadia Margolis has called, quote, an isolationist, racist, repressive form of patriotism, unquote. Nationalism has more than one aspect, however. Seen from a slightly different angle, Joan's career also resembles the national liberation movements of the 20th century, I would argue. Her insistence that the French have a right to a French king could be seen as her grasping the principle of national self-determination centuries before the principle was named. The principle is now well established in the United Nations Charter and in international law. Hostility towards outsiders is vicious and terrible, but Joan saw the English as invaders and occupiers who were trying to establish an empire, not unlike how most Ukrainians see the Russians. And she thought the French had the same right to resist the domination of another nation that most of us would concede the Ukrainians have. Also, Joan hated the English for being in France, not for being English. One of the famous stories about her is that she heard a dying English soldier's last confession and tried to comfort him as he died after the Battle of Patay. So, even as a nationalist, before there was a word for it, Joan makes at best an awkward icon for conservative values due to her dramatic upending of gender norms. Her judges at Rouen particularly noticed this, which leads to our third question about male-dominated institutions' willingness to recognize women who claim and exercise authority. One of the charges against her in her trial for heresy was that she, quote, steadfastly refuses to carry out tasks proper to her sex, in all things behaving more like a man than a woman, unquote. Her tart response was, as for the other womanly tasks, she says there are enough other women to do them. Joan's resistance to traditional gender roles won the approval of no less a feminist than the late Andrea Dworkin, who wrote of her, the church that killed her may now identify her as a martyr, but for women inspired by her legend, she is a martial hero, luminous with genius and courage, an emblem of possibility and potentiality consistently forbidden, obliterated, or denied by the rigid tyranny of sex role imperatives or the outright humiliation of second-class citizenship. By putting on armor and successfully leading an army into battle, Joan overturned gender norms in a dramatically visible way. She herself took no credit, attributing all her success to God, and some have suggested that she was only present at the battles as an inspiring figure, a kind of mascot or a cheerleader. Nonetheless, at least one military historian, Kelly DeVries of Loyola University, Maryland, has written a book on the thesis that Joan was, as his subtitle states, a military leader in the full sense. Just as remarkable, I think, and just as relevant to our own times, was Joan's challenge to the masculine claim of a monopoly of knowledge about God and the related claim to exclusive authority on religious questions. Almost every question asked by the church authorities who put Joan on trial betrays their assumption that they understand her spiritual experience better than she does herself. Once they determined that there were visual phenomena accompanying the voices, she called it a great light. They want to know about the saints' clothes and hair, whether Joan could smell them, whether she touched them. These questions were motivated by their knowledge, and you'd like to put scare quotes around knowledge there, their knowledge that angels had no corporeal presence. Accordingly, if Joan touched one, the presences must have been demonic. This knowledge was deployed to murderous effect in the witch trials of the next 200 years. Joan is not caught in any of these traps, as seen in her famous answer to the question of whether St. Michael was naked. Do you think God can't find him clothes? So relentlessly do the judges seek to undermine Joan's own sense of her reality that the trial could be called a months-long case of gaslighting. They succeeded briefly for a few days. For a few days, Joan denied her voices, but they stayed with her, insisted on their own reality, and in the end, she went to the stake for them. The judges obviously could not credit that God would entrust an important message to a modestly born, uneducated 17-year-old girl rather than themselves. They explained to Joan more than once the concept of the church militant. In the church triumphant, in heaven, all saved souls are on the same footing and equally in the presence of God, but in the church militant on earth, God has wisely appointed certain men to carry out God's will. Joan is repeatedly asked whether she will submit to the church militant, and she always answers the same way. Asked, this is a quotation from the trial, asked whether she believes she is subject to God's church on earth, that is, to the Father, the Pope, the cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and other prelates of the church, she said, yes, God being first served. The judges see clearly enough the threat posed by Joan's claim to have her own knowledge of what God wants. To quote again from the trial record, and they showed her how dangerous it is to presume one is worthy of such visions and revelations. The apostasy of the people could follow from this, the creation of new sects, and many other evils, to the ruin of the church and the Catholic people. Her answer remains, I wait upon God. Surprisingly, the judges seem less disturbed by Joan's claim that God communicates with her than by her wearing men's clothes. The third paragraph of the trial record explicitly comments on this topic. The report has now reached many places that this woman, utterly disregarding the honor due the female sex, throwing off the bridle of modesty, and forgetting all feminine decency, wore the disgraceful clothing of men, a shocking and vile monstrosity. The horrified tone recurs throughout the document. Here we have a fourth way in which Joan's brief but extraordinary career continues to engage us. She can be considered a trans icon. The judges tried whatever means they could think of to get her to wear women's clothes. Besides quoting the book of Deuteronomy at her, and that 22:5, the woman shall not wear the apparel of men, they refused to let her take the sacrament of communion in men's clothes. A heavy blow for Joan, who, when free, had habitually taken the sacrament at least once a day. When she was led out to be burned wearing a paper hat with the words heretic, relapse, apostate, idolater, her clothes were the basis of the charge of idolatry. As the record puts it, on this point, the clerks say that you blaspheme God and scorn him in his sacraments. You are prone to idolatry, and you worship yourself and your clothing, according to the rites of the heathen. The judges seemed to fear that Joan, by wearing men's clothes, was undermining the very foundations of the cosmos. A surprising conclusion, but one we hear variations of in our own society to this day. Joan may have had practical reasons for wearing men's clothes, such as safety or convenience, but she persisted even when her doing so aroused the hostility of her jailers and her judges, even when it led to her being denied the sacrament of communion, and even when it meant she could be burned at the stake. Her clothing was for her inextricably bound up with her mission to deliver France. When I have finished what God sent me here to do, she told her judges, I'll wear women's clothes. Cultural historian Marina Warner writes that Joan's clothes, quote, ranked of equal significance for her with the truth of her voices. The visions and the dress were one and indivisible, unquote. We often trivialize cross-dressing or joke about it, but Joan stands as a compelling historical example of how deep and authentic an aspect of selfhood it can be. After months of intimidation, she renounced both the voices and her male dress for a few days, out of fear of the fire, as she put it. But in the end, she went to the stake rather than renounce the truth she felt had been given her by God. To conclude, Joan is not just a colorful passage in medieval history, not just good source material for costume drama, but someone whose life and work lead us to questions that remain difficult to answer but undeniably important. As I was working on this paper, someone asked me if there was a person in our own day who was comparable to Joan of Arc. It took me a while, a few hours. Eventually I thought of Greta Thunberg. A teenage girl addressing the United Nations is less extraordinary than a teenage girl in command of an army, but it is still extraordinary. And in both cases, a young woman's clarity of purpose, moral insight, and sheer persistence were able to break through the crust surrounding people who had stopped caring and made them care again. At sometimes, in some places, the clear voice of a young woman is the most powerful thing in the world. Thank you. Yeah, questions?
Thank you so much for that fascinating paper. I wonder if we could take the question of male dress and its meaning even further, though. In Shaw's play, and he based a lot of it on the trial transcript, Joan says, when I was with the soldiers, I dressed as a soldier. I wanted them to think of me as a soldier. And that in many ways, the male dress was also an important form of protection for her. And Warner argues, I believe, that when she finally does sign the recantation and they take away her male dress and she's in women's clothing, that she may well have been gang raped, and which is tragic. And the fact that male clothing would have, the guards would have in some ways been reluctant to touch her when she was dressed as a man, and felt that it was okay to do it when she was dressed as a woman. So I think the clothing is really incredibly significant to her, in her sense of self. And I would also just add, I think it's also important to think of the saints who spoke with her. You mentioned St. Michael, but all the other two are women. There's St. Margaret and there's St. Catherine, and these were both examples of incredibly brave young women. And I think that meant a great deal to her too, in formulating who she was.
Yes, I think there were, really solid practical reasons for adopting male dress, which kind of resemble Shakespeare's comedy heroines who cross-dress as a way of for safety's sake, and there's probably a good deal of that. It's I guess it's her persisting in it when she's a prisoner that makes you wonder. This is who I'm supposed to be, and the judges keep, at one point, they keep asking her, did God tell you to do this? And she finds ways to not exactly say that, but she clearly thought that. This was part of her, what the voices told her to do. And so I think there's the practical reasons and the safety reasons, but there's a kind of surplus there for her that interesting to think about. Yeah. Steve?
There seems to be a little contradiction here that you figure out, you remember the time that they were in, and the fact that she was leading armies. Did you come across anything that there was pushback against a woman trying to lead an army at that time period? That would be difficult today, let alone 500-600 years ago. So was there was no controversy about that at all?
There was controversy. Yeah, oh yeah. There were some people close to Charles, the king, who said this is crazy, and we don't really know why Charles never offered to ransom her when she was captured. But some of it may have been that there were people in the court who thought this is got this loose cannon crazy girl, let's just cut her ties now. And a lot of this came up in the 1450s. Charles had a trial to reverse the heresy trial, and which was also in some ways just as prejudiced as the the heresy trial. But several people came forward to testify to how skillful she was in making decisions about placement of artillery, for instance. And she did actually go into battle a couple of times. She was wounded a couple of times. So there was certainly pushback, and I think it was probably something of an indicator of a willingness to suspend disbelief. Maybe she is the real thing, and if she's the real thing, then God is looking out for us. And so, but especially when she started losing, a lot of people drifted away. Yeah.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Hi, Scott.
Hi, Sam.
Excellent paper to start off the new semester.
Thank you.
In your introduction, you mentioned several creatives who have been inspired and created works of art. I know you are a creative, a lyricist, a songwriter. I was wondering, have you written anything that was somehow informed by Joan of Arc? Or
He asked that question even though he knows the answer. Yes, I have. To the second verse of Two Sides of Every Door, which is a song I wrote, and I played in a band with Sam, it's about Joan of Arc. Yeah. So I am one of the less illustrious people on the list of people who have been.
Can we hear the song?
Not.
I'll put it on Tom Carroll Facebook.
Okay, so I guess the answer is yes, you will be able to hear the song.
Well, I'm just thinking about I think it was the second question. Can God show partiality to a nation? Well, there's Israel, yes.
Oh.
So for a Jew, certainly, I mean, I've enjoyed worshiping with your congregation a couple of times and realized that more historical or ancient predilection does translate into contemporary reality, as many Jews really deal with current day Israel, even though with all the things happening right now, it makes it hard to support in the same way. So and for Christians who struggle with being grafted into the tradition, we also take Israel as a sign of great preference, shall we say, from God. So just thinking about that, how does that square with what you found about Joan?
Well, that's the aspect of Joan I have the most trouble with, I think. We can probably think of some of our friends and neighbors who think that the United States is God's chosen people, and we're probably wish they didn't think that way, that it would make more sense for all of us to think that we are all God's people. We all should try harder to live as one big family. But insofar as the notion can galvanize the people, maybe there's a place for it. I feel deeply ambivalent about it myself. I sure feel deeply ambivalent about Israel. But our own sort of Christian nationalist patriots, I feel very, very ambivalent about. So, but that's why Joan is an icon for the right too, in France, and that's right up until this past May they were out there again with the wreath. So, yeah. That's anyone else on Christian nationalism? Want to take a swing at that? There was an old joke, old Jew praying to God, why don't you choose somebody else? Evelyn.
This is shifting subject. As I recall, Joan was canonized in 1925. 1920. Okay, thank you. What has stayed with me about her story, in addition to leading an army, is how she was not caught in an attempt to demonstrate that she was a heretic when she was asked a very tricky theological question. And as I recall, and Scott, do feel free to correct me if I have this wrong, but she was asked by a tribunal, are you in a state of grace? Had she answered yes, she would have been in big trouble. But instead, she said, if I am, may God keep me there. If I'm not, may He put me there. That was brilliant. And to think that she could do that under duress. So,
yes, just the sheer presence of mind, I think, that sort of saw that trap open up and knew a great way around it, because they were trying to trip her up. It was like, and she didn't have much in the way of formal education. She was not a theologian. Here she's got this sort of big shots from the University of Paris who are trying to find her vulnerability, and she has no defense attorney. She has no one. She's utterly alone, but utterly brave. And she saw that answer, and she just went right around it. And so that's a sort of, doesn't seem like a crazy person to me. Seems like someone who's incredibly self-possessed in some ways. and a really extraordinary native intelligence, however uneducated she may have been. So one of the more, in fact, the Latin scribe, right, or the official record of the court, which survives, interestingly enough, put next to that, good answer. You know.
Or the voice of God.
Yeah, maybe she got a special shot. Okay, thank you so much. Next month's speaker is Jocelyn Bullock, and so we are off and running, and I hope to I'll see you in a month. Oh, thank you, Mark. Thank my bacon.